Have you ever imagined the silence of heaven, not the absence of sound, but the vast living stillness of a realm where every voice is tuned to the same unbroken harmony, where the light itself breathes in step with the will of the Most High? It is the silence before creation's morning song, the unshakable calm of a kingdom untouched by decay. And yet, one day, that silence changed. It was not shattered by thunder or broken by the clash of swords, but by something far more dangerous, by a choice. A single choice, made not in ignorance, but in full knowledge of who he is and what it would mean to stand against him. From the heights where the rivers of fire flowed before the throne, watchers stood, their eyes filled with the light of the Ancient of Days. They had been appointed guardians not of treasure nor of power, but of mankind's destiny. The human race was young then, still walking in the purity of the first generations. These beings had witnessed the birth of worlds, had heard the voice that spoke the galaxies into place. They were not ignorant creatures fumbling in the dark. They were keepers of the divine order. And yet, they looked down. They saw the earth, the fields of men and women, the beauty of flesh and breath, and something foreign stirred in them. It began in whispers, unspoken thoughts, questions that had no place in a loyal heart. Why should we only watch? Why should we not take one glance led to another? The glances turned to desire, desire to resolve, resolve to conspiracy. The vault of heaven still shone, but somewhere within its golden expanse, a fissure had begun to form. The ancient writings tell us that the heavens can be shaken not by storm or earthquake, but by rebellion. This was not the rebellion of fools, but of beings who knew the cost and weighed it against their hunger. The Book of Enoch names their leader, the one who dared to bind the others with an oath upon Mount Hermon, sealing their fate. But before the mountain, before the oath, there was this moment, the first crack. And in the moment of that crack, the silence of heaven became something else, a held breath, waiting for the unthinkable. Even now, the question lingers like smoke after a fire: what could cause an angel, clothed in the radiance of the Almighty, to choose exile over glory? What force could stir in a heart fashioned for worship, strong enough to turn its gaze away from the face of God today? We step into that moment, not to excuse it, not to soften it, but to see it for what it was, the first step toward a cataclysm that would draw both heaven and earth into judgment. Long before the oath at Mount Hermon, before the first seeds of defiance took root in the hearts of the watchers, the created order stood in a harmony we can barely comprehend. The Book of Jubilees speaks of a time when the heavenly and earthly realms were in unbroken alignment, when the rhythm of time itself moved to the calendar of the Most High, unaltered and unsullied. The sons of heaven, those radiant beings later called watchers, moved freely between the courts of glory and the expanse of the stars, keeping their appointed stations with reverent precision. Humanity's early generations still bore the echo of Eden in their walk and speech. They understood the land not as a possession, but as a gift to be tended. They knew the name of the one who breathed life into them, not as a distant concept, but as a presence as real as the air they drew into their lungs. The Watcher's charge was not to rule over mankind, but to safeguard them, to teach them what was pure, to guide them away from corruption, to keep the boundaries set at the beginning. And in those days, the sky was not silent. It was alive with the songs of the morning stars, with the thunder of rivers that flowed like molten light before the throne. The four winds carried messages between realms, each gust a whisper of the king's will. The sun did not scorch, nor the moon diminish, for all creation worked as one great tapestry, every thread in place. It was not perfection in the way we imagine without struggle or growth, but perfection in its alignment, where even struggle served the purpose of glory. But perfection is a fragile thing, not because it is weak, but because anything out of place will stand against it in sharp relief. When the first watcher allowed his gaze to linger too long upon the daughters of men, it was not yet sin, but it was the first misstep. The earliest signs were imperceptible to those on earth. No human eye could see that a sentinel in the heavens had paused in his duty. Yet in the realm of spirit, even hesitation leaves a mark. Jubilees hints at these shifts, moments when appointed times were delayed, when the messengers tarried before delivering their charge, when the song of one star faltered for just a beat. None of these alone could unravel the order, but each was a loose thread waiting to be pulled. And once one thread is taken in hand, the temptation to see how much can be undone becomes its own kind of hunger. In those early years, the darkness had not yet fallen, but its shadow was already stretching across the horizon. The story of the Watcher's fall does not begin in sudden violence. It begins in quiet compromise, the kind that hides beneath beauty, the kind that cloaks itself in the language of curiosity and possibility. And as the balance held for a time, the heavens themselves seemed to lean forward, as though knowing the stillness before a storm is never the end of the story. It began with patterns too subtle for human senses to register, but in the courts of heaven, nothing passes unnoticed. The Book of Enoch tells of the appointed courses of the sun and moon, the fixed paths of the stars, each a law written into creation by the voice of the Most High. To alter them was unthinkable, and yet certain watchers, entrusted with the stewardship of these signs, began to let their vigilance slip. A watch missed here, a delay in their celestial rotation there, and the perfect rhythm of the heavens shivered almost imperceptibly, as though one string in an eternal harp had gone just slightly out of tune. Those who still held their posts with unwavering loyalty saw it first. They noticed when the light of a particular star burned dim for an hour longer than it should have. They saw the moon linger too long in one phase, as though hesitant to yield her place. These were not accidents. Such disruptions were the silent handwriting of divided loyalty, the first traces of an inward drift towards self. The angels were not bound to fatigue or forgetfulness. They were bound only to the will they chose to obey. And here, in the hush before rebellion, some began to choose otherwise. On earth, no one saw the shifts in the heavens, but men and women began to sense other changes, small, intangible currents in the air. Prayers once answered swiftly seemed delayed. Dreams once clear and comforting became troubled, thick with symbols no one could decipher. In the high places, the wind carried whispers, a strange mingling of reverence and restlessness, as if some invisible company had drawn nearer to the lives of mortals not to guide. but to watch with a different kind of intent. Jubilees preserves the echo of this moment. It speaks of the days when the watchers were among men, and of knowledge given that was never meant to be known, seeds of wisdom planted out of season. The first of these seeds were small hints of the metals hidden in the earth, the way to carve stones to harness the light, the subtle shaping of words to stir desire rather than devotion. None of it yet broke the covenant outright, but each gift bent ever so slightly away from its true purpose, like a branch trained to grow in the wrong direction. In heaven, the loyal ones sent warnings, but the fissure was widening. Those who strayed found each other, drawn together not by shared duty, but by shared hunger. And as they gathered, the air itself seemed to change less like the fragrance of the altar and more like the heavy stillness before lightning strikes. The signs were written plainly for those who could read the language of the sky. The order was tilting. It would not tilt forever without consequence. In creation, every imbalance seeks correction, and the correction of heaven is never gentle when the disease has sunk too deep. Still, for now, the hand of judgment was stayed. The Most High let the signs play out, each one a silent summons to repentance that would go unanswered. For once the sky is rewritten by the hand of rebellion, the story that follows can only lead to the edge of the abyss. There comes a moment in every rebellion when hesitation dies. The thoughts that once flickered in secrecy are spoken aloud, and once spoken, they cannot be called back. For the watchers, that moment was carved into the slopes of a mountain whose name still trembles in ancient memory. Hermon. Its ridges rose like the teeth of a great beast, its summit lost in veils of cloud. Men feared to climb it, but the watchers were not men. They gathered there in the twilight between day and night, when the sun's light bled into the deep blue of the heavens, and shadows grew long enough to hide their faces from the gaze of the throne. The Book of Enoch names their leader Semjaza, whose voice had once been counted among the most steadfast in the choirs of heaven. It was he who called them together, he who spoke the words that would bind them not to their Creator, but to each other. They were many, 200 in all, arrayed in the armor of their own glory, wings folded close, eyes bright with resolve that no longer looked upward. Around them, the wind moved as if in protest, but they did not hear. Or perhaps they heard and chose to ignore it. The oath was simple, but it was everything. They swore by their own names, the very names once inscribed in the courts of light, that they would not turn back from what they were about to do. They bound themselves with the seal of their number, vowing that if judgment came, they would share it together. In that vow lay both courage and madness, the courage to stand against the Almighty, and the madness to think such a stand could endure. Jubilees remembers this as the point of no return. The covenant they had been given from the beginning was not simply a set of rules, it was their lifeline to the order of creation itself. To cut it was to step into a void with no path back. Yet on that mountain, under the dimming sky, they cut it. And as the words of their oath drifted into the air, the mountain seemed to drink them in like poison into its roots. Below, the world was still unaware. Men and women tended their fields, children laughed in the dust, and the rivers sang to the sea. but a shadow had crossed the threshold between heaven and earth. A shadow that would soon take shape in ways the world could not imagine. Some have wondered why the Most High did not strike them down in that moment. The truth is that judgment delayed is never judgment denied. Every heartbeat they took from that point onward was borrowed time, each breath a measure of mercy that would only sharpen the weight of their eventual fall. The mountain kept their secret for now, but the heavens had already recorded it. And in the eternal books, once a line is written in the ink of rebellion, it will be read aloud before the universe in the appointed hour. From that night on, the Watchers were no longer just guardians, they were conspirators. The light they carried still shone, but it was no longer the reflection of the one they had served. It had become a fire of their own making, bright enough to dazzle the eyes of men, but destined to burn everything it touched. When the Watchers descended from Mount Hermon, they did not come as conquerors in open defiance. They came as givers. Their glory still clung to them like the gold of the sun after dawn, and to mortal eyes, they seemed nothing less than the answers to unspoken prayers. Men welcomed them into their settlements. Women looked upon them with wonder. Children reached for their hands without fear. For the Watchers wore no sign of rebellion on their faces. They came bearing gifts. The first of these gifts seemed harmless, even noble. They taught men to read the signs of the stars, to measure the seasons with precision, to harness the metals sleeping in the bones of the earth. They showed them how to cut gemstones until they caught the light like drops of fire, how to carve the wood of the cedars so it bent to the will of the craftsman. They taught women the secrets of adornment, how to mix pigments into dyes that bled richer than the flowers of the fields, how to weave gold into their hair until it gleamed like the morning sun. But each gift was a key, and every key opened a door not meant to be opened. The knowledge of the stars was not given to inspire worship of the Creator, but to bind men to the cycles of fate and omen. The metals and gemstones were not fashioned into tools of cultivation, but into weapons of death and ornaments of vanity. The paints and perfumes became snares of seduction, turning the gaze inward rather than upward. The Book of Enoch names the ones who spread this forbidden wisdom: Azazel, who taught men the making of swords and knives; Barachiel, who revealed the secrets of astrology; Kokabel, who charted the constellations not for glory, but for control. Jubilees remembers the same, though it cloaks their names in shadow, as if to deny them even the legacy of their infamy. In the beginning, no one saw the danger. Life became easier, more beautiful, more thrilling. Songs were sung not to the Creator, but to the wonders wrought by the hands of men under the tutelage of their celestial guests. Temples began to rise not in His name, but in the image of those who had descended. The Watchers accepted the offerings, their eyes shining with the satisfaction of kings whose thrones needed no coronation. Yet beneath this new age of splendor, the foundation was already rotting. The gifts had awakened desires that could never be satisfied, cravings that pulled humanity further from the simplicity of their first calling. Where there had been peace, envy began to stir. Where there had been trust, fear found fertile soil. And all the while, the heavens watched. The loyal ones saw the widening gulf between the Most High and his creation. They heard the laughter of men who no longer called upon the name above all names. They watched the Watchers walk openly among mortals as if the order of heaven had been rewritten. But heaven's law had not changed. It never would. And for every gift given, a debt was being written, one that could only be paid in judgment. The day came when the gifts were no longer enough. The knowledge, the craft, the power they had all served to weave a bridge between the Watchers and humanity. But it was not a bridge meant for worship or service. It was a bridge for desire. From the first moment their eyes lingered too long on the daughters of men, the outcome had been inevitable. Now, that desire demanded form. The ancient records are stark in their telling. The Book of Enoch spares no detail, and they took wives for themselves, each choosing for himself, and they began to go into them. It is not written as if by accident, nor as if the women were ignorant of who these beings were. The Watchers did not come in the shadow of night, but in the open, their beauty dazzling, their stature towering above the sons of earth. The women, drawn by the allure of the divine mingled with the mortal, gave themselves freely, not knowing they were binding themselves to a fate that would mark the generations to come. Jubilees records the same sin with the weight of inevitability. These unions were not merely acts of passion, they were violations of the boundary set at creation that each kind should bring forth after its kind. In crossing that line, the Watchers struck at the very framework of the Most High's design, as if to rewrite the laws that govern life itself. The covenant between heaven and earth was not just bent, now it was shattered. From these unions came offspring unlike any the world had known. They were giants, Nephilim mighty in strength, monstrous in appetite, their presence a living reminder of the breach. They consumed more than the earth could yield, and when the earth could not sustain them, they turned to consuming flesh, not their own. Violence spread like fire through dry grass, and blood cried out from the ground in tones too loud for heaven to ignore. Yet the true corruption was not in their size or their strength, but in the hearts of men and women who had once walked in the shadow of the Most High. The children of the Watchers taught mankind the ways of domination and cruelty, of pleasures pursued without restraint, of gods made in the image of human lust. The line between the sacred and the profane blurred until it was gone, and the earth, once called good, groaned under the weight of defilement. The Watchers looked upon their offspring with pride, not shame. To them, the Nephilim were proof that their choice had been worth the risk, a new race that bore their image and carried their power. They did not see or refuse to see that each giant born was another stone laid in the road to their own destruction. Above it all, the heavens remained unshaken in their decree. The breach was complete, the corruption undeniable. There would be no more warnings, no more silent appeals to repentance. The time of reckoning was approaching, and its shadow had already fallen across the mountains and valleys of the earth. It is written that the earth has a voice, though men rarely hear it. Every act of bloodshed, every injustice, every violation of what was meant to be sacred sends a vibration through creation itself, a sound that rises, unseen, toward the courts of heaven. In those days after the Nephilim walked upon the earth, that voice became a roar. The ground drank the lifeblood of the innocent until it was saturated. and the heavens could no longer remain silent. The faithful watchers, those who had not joined the rebellion, looked down with grief too deep for words. They saw the humans they had once guarded, now enslaved to desires and fears planted by their own brethren. The violence of the giants had become more than a plague. It was a culture. Strength was exalted above mercy, cunning above truth, and beauty was no longer a reflection of the Creator's glory, but a currency to be traded and corrupted. The Book of Enoch tells us that the souls of men began to cry out for judgment, their voices carried before the Most High like smoke from 1,000 burning altars. Jubilees preserves the echo of those cries in the language of covenant, how the agreement between God and His creation was being broken, not only by the heavenly transgressors, but by those on earth who welcomed and celebrated them. It was in this growing darkness that the first signs of divine movement appeared. Angels who had stood in silence were now sent as messengers, their steps swift, their faces set with the gravity of what was coming. They carried reports before the throne, naming the leaders of the rebellion, recounting the depth of human corruption, and declaring that the time of patient waiting had drawn to its close. In heaven's council, the matter was settled. The rebellion of the Watchers was not a wound that could be healed. It was an infection that threatened the very life of the created order. The Most High would not allow His image to be erased from the earth. The decision would not only address the sin of the angels, but the contagion they had unleashed among men. Yet even as the decree began to take shape, mercy lingered in the air. For though judgment was certain, the execution of it was deliberate. Each step would be measured, each action precise, so that the whole creation would know this was not the wrath of a tyrant, but the justice of a righteous king. The faithful among the watchers withdrew to their stations, watching the earth below with eyes that saw both the horror of what had become and the inevitability of what must come next. The giants walked unchallenged, the cities grew loud with violence, and the human heart was turning ever harder. The outcry had reached heaven, and heaven had answered. The storm was forming, and nothing would stop it from breaking. There are moments in the history of heaven and earth when the will of the Most High is not whispered through prophets, nor hinted in the turning of seasons, but spoken openly in the full assembly of His hosts. This was such a moment. The court of heaven gathered, the countless multitudes arrayed in ranks that stretched beyond sight. At the center, the throne blazed with unapproachable light, its radiance swallowing the shadows of the rebellious, as if to remind all present that darkness has no power here. The reports had been given. The names of the guilty had been read aloud: Semjaza, Azazel, and the rest of the 200 who had sworn their oath beneath Hermon. Their crimes were laid bare: the corruption of humanity, the perversion of knowledge, the violation of the boundary between spirit and flesh, the unleashing of offspring whose violence now devoured the earth. None could dispute the record. None could speak in their defense. Then came the voice. It was not loud in the way men measure volume, but it filled every space, every thought, as though creation itself leaned in to listen. They shall see no more the holy places which they have defiled. Bind them in the valleys of the earth, in darkness, until the day of their judgment. The words rolled like thunder through eternity, each syllable sealing the fate of those who had traded eternal glory for a moment's desire. But the decree did not end with the Watchers. As for their offspring, The giants who have filled the earth with blood, destroy them. Let them perish by the hands of one another. Let their breath be cut off, that the earth may find rest. This was not cruelty. It was the resetting of a balance that could not be restored by lesser measures. To carry out the sentence, specific orders were given. Mighty angels Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel were each entrusted with a portion of the task. Michael would rally the loyal hosts against the Watchers. Gabriel would stir their monstrous sons to turn their strength against each other. Raphael would bind Azazel and cast him into the desert, covering him with jagged stones until the appointed day. Uriel would deliver the warning to the chosen man who would survive what was coming. The air in the council was heavy with the gravity of what had been set in motion. These were not threats, they were certainties. Heaven does not speak in empty promises, and once the decree is given, it moves through creation like a wind no one can stop. The angels bowed, their faces set like flint, for they knew the hour of execution was near. And so the orders went forth, descending through the layers of heaven toward the earth below. The mountains, seas, and skies did not yet reveal the storm, but it was coming born not of chaotic rage, but of the steady, unstoppable justice of the one who had spoken. The Watchers still walked among men, their giant sons still roamed in pride, unaware that their days had already been numbered in the books of eternity. The decree had gone forth, but to the Watchers and their children, the sky above still seemed unchanged. The sun rose, the rivers ran, the earth gave its yield. They mistook heaven's patience for heaven's silence, not knowing that the sentence was already moving toward them with the inevitability of the tide. And then, without warning, the first cracks appeared not in the heavens this time, but in their own ranks. It began as a quarrel between two chieftains among the Nephilim, both vast in stature and swollen with the pride of their unnatural strength. Over land, over tribute, over the favor of mortal kings they fought. At first it was sport, a display of power to remind the world who ruled it. But something unseen was at work in their fury, a whisper not their own, planted by the hand of Gabriel in obedience to the decree. Blades were drawn, and for the first time, the blood of a giant was spilled by another giant. Violence, once directed outward against mankind, began to turn inward. The alliances forged by their fathers crumbled in days. City rose against city. War bands clashed without quarter, and the ground shook beneath their battles. The earth, which had groaned under their oppression, now drank their blood as if in grim relief. Men watched from hiding, too afraid to intervene, too astonished to look away, as their tormentors destroyed each other with the same strength they had used to enslave them. The Watchers saw it and understood this was no accident. This was the opening strike of the judgment they had been warned would never come. For all their wisdom and power, they could not stop it. They tried to call their sons back to unity, to rally them against a common foe, but the seeds of hatred had taken root too deep. Every insult remembered, every slight magnified, every ambition unchecked now burst into open war. The Book of Enoch tells that the cries of the Nephilim's slaughter rose as high as the cries of their victims once had. Jubilees echoes it in its own restrained way. speaking of the days when the earth devoured those who had devoured her. The same land that had buckled beneath their weight now became their grave, swallowing them into pits and valleys without number. For the first time since they descended, fear touched the watchers, not fear of battle. They had no rival on earth, but fear of something they could not see, could not strike, could not command. The order they had built was unraveling in their hands, and every attempt to tighten their grip only hastened the collapse. And still, above the chaos, the heavens remained clear and still. But to those who understood the signs, that stillness was not peace. It was the gathering calm before a greater wave, the one that would not simply pit them against each other, but sweep the rebellion from the earth altogether. The Watchers had seen the power of the throne before. Now they were about to feel it. When the giants' cries began to fade, not because the slaughter had ended, but because there were fewer left to kill, an unnatural quiet settled over the land. Cities lay in ruin, their gates splintered, their walls blackened with smoke. The earth bore the scars of their battles, valleys carved by their wrath, rivers turned red with the memory of their violence. To the few men and women who still survived, it seemed as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then came the sound. It was not the tramp of mortal armies, nor the rush of storm winds, but a resonance that seemed to move through the bones of the earth. It was the sound of heaven's approach. The Watchers heard it first, not with their ears, but in the core of their being, for it was the voice of the order they had abandoned. What they had once stood within was now bearing down upon them as a foreign and hostile force. From the heights of the eastern sky, the first forms appeared, shapes brighter than the sun, yet moving with the silence of predatory lions. Michael led the vanguard, his presence a storm of unyielding authority. Gabriel followed, flanked by warriors whose eyes were as sharp as blades. Behind them came Raphael and Uriel, not in the splendor of peace, but clothed for the execution of judgment. The earth responded to their arrival. Mountains quaked, seas drew back as if in dread, and the air thickened until every breath was labor. Men fell to their faces without knowing why. Even the Nephilim, swollen with their own power, faltered in their stride when they beheld the advancing hosts. The Watchers who had remained loyal stood apart, their countenances grave, for they knew this was not the hour for pleading. This was the hour when the sentence given in the high court would be carried out without delay. The rebels, Semjaza, Azazel, and the rest looked upon the hosts and knew that the chain of events they had set in motion had reached its final link. Enoch records that the command was given without hesitation. The leaders of the rebellion were to be seized, bound hand and foot with chains not forged of metal, but of light that burned like molten gold and could not be broken. The very strength they had once used to defy heaven was turned inward, their limbs heavy as stone, their wings locked against their backs. They cried out not in repentance, but in rage and defiance. They invoked the beauty of their original purpose, the authority they once held, but their words were like dust against the wind. Raphael moved to Azazel, casting him down into the desolation, covering him with jagged stones until his form vanished into the earth. Michael and Gabriel wrestled the rest into submission, dragging them toward the chasms appointed for their imprisonment. Above them, the sky remained without cloud, but the light had shifted. It was not the gold of dawn, nor the fire of sunset. It was the white, unblinking glare of a justice that misses nothing. The descent of the hosts was not yet complete, for their work on earth was only half done. The watchers were bound, but their offspring still roamed, and the earth itself still groaned for cleansing. The next blow would not come from the sword, but from the floodgates of creation itself. With the watchers bound and cast into their appointed prisons, the earth might have seemed quieter, but the corruption they had sown still roamed freely. The Nephilim who remained, though fewer in number, still devoured, still dominated, still carried in their veins the defiance of their fathers. The soil itself was stained with the violence of centuries, and the breath of mankind was steeped in rebellion. Judgment could not be half measured. The disease had to be burned from the body of creation, not by fire, but by a deluge that would wash the world back to its foundations. The command went forth from the throne, and the very architecture of the cosmos responded. The deep places beneath the oceans stirred, as if some ancient creature had turned in its sleep. The vault of the skies, which had held back the primeval waters since the second day of creation, began to tremble. The wind shifted, heavy with the scent of rain not yet fallen, and the horizon took on the strange dimness of a world bracing for impact. On earth, the chosen man received his warning. Noah, righteous in his generation, heard the voice of the Most High not as thunder from the clouds, but as the steady certainty of truth pressing into his spirit. He was told what must come and what he must do to live through it. While the world mocked, he began the work, his hands shaping the ark that would carry the seed of the new earth through the waters of destruction. The Book of Enoch records that as Noah built, the cries of the doomed grew louder, not cries of repentance, but of outrage. The Nephilim jeered at the thought that anything could destroy them. Yet their confidence was already crumbling. The skies darkened before their eyes, and the air pressed down upon them with a weight they could not explain. The animals began to move in unnatural ways, leaving their ranges and heading toward the place where Noah labored, drawn by a guidance they could not resist. Then, on the appointed day, the hand of restraint was lifted. The fountains of the great deep broke open, and waters surged upward from beneath the ground. At the same time, the floodgates of heaven were loosed, and the rains poured down not in drops, but in sheets that blurred the horizon and swallowed the land. Rivers swelled beyond their banks in moments, and the valleys became seas. The Nephilim, for all their height and strength, found no refuge. The high places they once claimed as thrones became islands, then vanished beneath the rising tide. Their voices, which had once commanded cities, were lost in the roar of waters that recognized no king but the one who made them. Men and women clung to what they could, but the current was relentless, sweeping away the monuments, the palaces, the weapons, the very marks of their defiance. From above, the loyal watchers observed in silence. There was no triumph in their gaze, only the sober knowledge that this was the only way to cleanse the world. The rain did not cease until every peak was covered, until the memory of the rebellion was buried beneath the waters, awaiting the day when the seas would give up their dead. And somewhere within the vastness of that flood, the ark moved steady and sure, carrying the hope of a world that would rise again. For 150 days, the world knew only water. The mountains that had once pierced the sky were gone. The cities, the altars, the gardens all erased beneath an endless expanse. The only sound was the ceaseless sigh of the wind across the surface, and even that seemed muted, as though creation itself were holding its voice in reverence for what had just passed. Inside the ark, Noah and his family moved through the dim light of the single window. Their days marked not by the sun's course now hidden, but by the rhythm of tending to the living cargo entrusted to them. They could not see the full measure of the destruction, but they could feel it. The weight of the judgment lay on their spirits like the lingering echo of a great bell, still vibrating long after the strike. Then, one morning, the change began. The wind shifted, not the heavy, burdened wind of the flood, but a new breath, steady and cleansing. Beneath the depths, the fountains of the great deep closed their mouths. Above, the floodgates of heaven sealed once more. The waters began to draw back, not in chaos, but in measured retreat, as if the hand that had unleashed them was now guiding them home. The first mountain peaks broke the surface like the spines of ancient creatures rising from sleep. Days passed, and more land emerged, though still far from ready to bear life again. The ark, carried by the will of the one who had commanded it, came to rest upon the slopes of Ararat, its timbers creaking against the rock. Noah waited. He did not rush to fling open the doors. He knew that deliverance, like judgment, comes in its appointed time. He sent out a raven, which did not return, for it found a place among the floating remnants of what had been. Later he sent a dove, but it found no place to rest and came back to him. The second time, it returned with an olive leaf, fresh and green, gripped in its beak, the first sign that life had begun to stir again upon the earth. The third time, the dove did not return at all. When the day came to leave the ark, the air was sharp with the scent of wet soil and new growth. The silence was no longer heavy. It was pregnant with promise. Noah stepped onto the ground with the caution of one entering a temple. For this was a world cleansed and reborn. Every footprint was a prayer, every breath a reminder that he walked in the aftermath of both wrath and mercy. The land was bare, stripped of the monuments and idols that had once crowded it. The giants were gone, their cities swallowed, their names fading into shadow. The watchers remained bound in their prisons beneath the earth, their voices silenced except for the muffled echoes that the wind sometimes carried over lonely valleys. Above it all, the sky was impossibly clear, as though washed by the very waters that had swept away the old order. This was not the end of the story, but a pause, the stillness in which the covenant would soon be spoken, a covenant that would bind heaven and earth in a new chapter of their long and intertwined history. The storm had passed, but the memory of it would never fade, for it was carved into the bones of the world and written in the hearts of the few who had seen it from the inside. When the ground was dry and the air was clear, Noah's first act was not to build a dwelling, nor to stake claim over the new land. He built an altar. Upon it he offered the clean animals and birds preserved through the flood, their smoke rising into the unbroken sky like a prayer without words. It was an offering not of repayment, for who can repay the gift of life, but of surrender, acknowledging that survival was not his own doing, but the will of the one who had chosen him. And the Most High answered, not with fire, as in later days, but with a promise. His voice came to Noah with the weight of eternity. Never again would he destroy all life by the waters of a flood. The judgment had been necessary, but the cleansing was complete. The covenant was not just with Noah, nor only with his sons, but with every living creature that would walk the renewed earth. Then, as a sign that could not be mistaken, he set his bow in the clouds. It was not a weapon poised for war, but a weapon laid down. Its arc turned toward heaven rather than earth. The rainbow became the visible seal of the covenant, a reminder that even in wrath, the heart of God moves toward mercy. From that day, each appearance of the bow in the clouds would speak the same silent assurance: the flood will not return. Yet the meaning ran deeper than the surface promise. The rainbow was a line drawn across the sky, marking a boundary not between rain and sun, but between judgment and grace. It was a declaration to all realms, seen and unseen, that the rebellion of the Watchers had been answered, its corruption purged, and that the Creator himself had fixed the terms of how history would move forward. The earth would be allowed to grow again, not because it deserved it, but because the plan of redemption was still unfolding for Noah and his family. The sight of the bow must have been both comfort and warning. Comfort, that they would not see the world swallowed again in their lifetimes. Warning, that though the flood would not return, the memory of it demanded vigilance. Evil could rise again, and when it did, its end might come by other means. The covenant also stood as a silent rebuttal to the Watchers' ambition. They had sought to rewrite the order of heaven and earth, to blend what God had separated, to create life in their own image. Now the Most High had written his own unalterable sign into the fabric of creation, one they could neither touch nor erase. Every storm that passed, every clearing sky, would display his answer to their rebellion, hanging above the earth like a crown that belonged to him alone. As the altar cooled and the day moved on, Noah stood beneath that bough, the clean air carrying the scent of wet earth and wood smoke. Behind him lay a world washed of its defilement. Before him lay the unknown years of rebuilding. But above it all was the sign, a bridge of light between heaven and earth. A reminder that the Creator's justice and mercy walk together, and that even after the gravest of storms, his covenant stands. Though the waters had carried away the bodies of the giants, and the prisons of the deep held the Watchers fast, their memory did not vanish with them. Evil rarely leaves the world without planting seeds, and the seeds sown before the flood had not all been destroyed. Some survived in the stories whispered around fires at night, in the symbols carved into stone, in the half-remembered songs that spoke of beings who descended from the sky and taught men wonders both beautiful and terrible. Generations after Noah, children still asked their elders about the days before the great waters came. Some spoke cautiously, framing those days as warnings, tales of the mighty ones whose pride brought ruin. But others spoke with a spark in their eyes, recalling the splendor of cities ruled by beings taller than trees, the gleam of weapons no human hand could forge, the mysteries of the stars once revealed to mortal minds. In this way, the infection of admiration for the fallen was passed on, hidden under the cloak of legend. The Book of Jubilees hints that even after the flood, unclean spirits born from the souls of the Nephilim remained upon the earth. They had no bodies, but they had memory, and they whispered into the hearts of men, stirring the same lust for power and knowledge that had doomed their fathers. The ancient covenant stood, but humanity's heart was still clay, ready to be molded by hands that sought to lead it astray. Idols began to rise again, this time in the image not of the Creator, but of the ancient rebels. The names of the Watchers, once cursed, became titles of honor among certain tribes. Tales of their gifts were recast as blessings rather than blights. The arts they had taught metallurgy, enchantment, the reading of omens returned, dressed in new forms but carrying the same old corruption. Even in the sacred writings, the shadow of the Watchers lingered as a warning. Prophets spoke of a day when the chains of the abyss would be loosed, when those bound in darkness would face their final judgment. The Apostle Peter, long centuries later, would write that God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment. The rebellion of the Watchers was not forgotten in heaven, nor would its consequences be erased from the story of earth until the end of days. For now, the shadow remained a thing unseen, yet felt like the smell of smoke long after the fire is out, or the aftertaste of bitterness on the tongue. Humanity had been given a second beginning, but it carried forward the memory of its first fall, and the whisper of the old temptation was never far from its ear. The rainbow in the clouds promised that the world would never again be drowned, but it did not promise that it would never again be tested. The story of the Watchers does not end with their imprisonment, nor with the flood that drowned their offspring. It runs like a deep current beneath the entire history of redemption, reappearing wherever pride seeks to overthrow the order of God, wherever creation is twisted for self-glory. Their fall stands as both a warning and a prophecy, a shadow of a greater rebellion yet to come. The prophets knew it. Isaiah spoke of a day when the host of heaven shall be punished, and the kings of the earth upon the earth, binding the destinies of the spiritual and earthly rebels in one final judgment. Daniel foresaw thrones set in place, books opened, and dominion stripped from those who had seized it unlawfully. In the New Testament, Jude recalls the angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, holding them forth as proof that divine justice is certain, no matter how long it tarries. Even the Messiah's ministry bore the imprint of their legacy. Every time Jesus cast out a demon, he was overturning the influence of the unclean spirits born from the Nephilim. Every time he proclaimed the coming kingdom, he was declaring the inevitable collapse of every counterfeit rule, heavenly or earthly, that set itself against the Most High. His death and resurrection were not only the redemption of mankind, but the decisive blow against the powers that had first corrupted it. Yet the Scriptures warn that the spirit of the Watchers will rise again in the last days, not in the same form, not as shining beings descending upon mountains, but in the renewed union of power, corruption, and deception, false wonders, secret knowledge, and the blending of boundaries God himself set will once again seduce the hearts of men. The final battle will not simply be over territory, but over truth. As the ancient lie returns, you shall be as gods, but their end is as certain as their return. Revelation speaks of the abyss opening only to be closed forever, of the rebellious hosts thrown into the lake of fire, of a new heaven and a new earth where no shadow remains. The chains that hold the watchers now are not temporary. They are the foretaste of an eternal sentence that will strip them of every trace of the glory they once knew. For those who hear their story, the call is clear: do not be dazzled by the gifts that come wrapped in rebellion. Do not mistake delayed judgment for its absence, and do not forget that the same God who brought the flood, who bound the watchers, who cleansed the earth, will once more rise to set all things right. The rebellion began on a mountain and will end before a throne, when every knee, angelic and human, bows to the name above all names. Until that day, the rainbow remains in the clouds, a bridge of light over a world still learning the cost of defiance. It speaks not only of mercy past, but of judgment to come, a reminder etched into the sky that the Most High's patience is not weakness, and his silence is not surrender. The Watcher's story is finished in one sense, but in another, it is still being written until the final reckoning closes the book forever.